I know that Banksy is really quite, passe, but I just thought throwing the flowers is really what I wanted as my website at the moment. So annoyed.
So this video
And you just shout a little bit louder.
yeah, okay, I've not started.
Okay.
Okay, so this video's it's very short. It's just an artist, Tom Ellis, talking about his work. But what I really liked was the way he held a paintbrush, and it kind of goes back to Barad's idea of that we've got no boundaries. That a blind person, when they use their stick, where does it start and begin? And she talks about Stephen Hawking and his wheelchair, and that there are no boundaries. And this artist works in a really fascinating way with his paintbrush and his body. I'm so impatient. Why don't I just stop?
It says full screen unavailable.
Yeah, why?
Find out more. Now try it. Is there sound?
Yeah, should be fine. I think it's loading.
As an artist, you're thinking, how do I work with this uncertainty? Well, I think painting is the most ridiculous thing I could ever think of doing. And you're working with that. 1 minute I'm behaving like a furniture maker. And another minute I'm painting. So these two things, totally different ways of working, but then how do they bounce off each other? What do they open up? It throws up these dilemmas in my practice. What's the relationship between the two? Do they need to be always exhibited in conjunction for it to be my work? But I like the way in which furniture can sort of depressurize the painterly kind of practice. A painting above a sofa is a very different proposition to a painting isolated on a gallery wall. Art exists in this duality of institutionalization or orthodoxy and rebellion or subversion. The idea of subversion has become its own institutionalized value. So I was basically looking for how as an artist you move forward from that. I need to act outside painting as well as within painting if I was going to define that push and pull. Some days you hit the nail on the head, some days the painting collapses around your ears. It's very easy as an artist to always want to show just the greatest works that you do, and I just find that limiting and less interesting, even though the alternative, middle, is risky, but I think the value is that it just throws open the conversation.
So what made you want to show them?
Because it just shows very clearly the way he's almost a part of his paintbrush. Because when he paints, he doesn't sort of hold it in pencil. He actually sort of embodies the whole thing very much. And I thought it related really well to where on
Do people want the lights off, by the way?
Let's keep it down.
Okay. All right, good. Go on.
where Merleau-Ponty says on page 157, I might have read this last week, blind man's stick has ceased to be an object for him and is no longer perceived for itself. Its point has become an area of sensitivity, extending the scope and active radius of touch and providing a parallel to sight. In the exploration of things, the length of the stick does not enter expressly as a middle term. To get used to a hat, a car, or a stick is to be transplanted into them, or conversely, to incorporate them into the bulk of our own body. Habit expresses our power of dilating our being in the world, or changing our existence by appropriating fresh instruments. And Merleau-Ponty calls this the body auxiliary. I just thought that was very interesting because the way that artists embody their work and it becomes a sort of extension of them.
Alberto, what do you think about that? What?
Did you say oh no?
Yes.
Oh.
I said, oh, come on. I don't want to say anything about that.
Okay, Emily?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I move in a very specific way when I'm painting that I don't use the same gestures any other time, I suppose.
I mean, I guess my question really was, and that's why I address it primarily to the people who use paint in their artwork, or who are a painter but don't use paint, or something like that. That painting is why you picked this out, because the painting, the person was using this stuff called paint.
Yeah, but I think also it really reminded me of a video I saw years ago, which was Monet at the very end of his life, and he was in bed, he couldn't move, and he painted with a huge stick up on his studio, and he did loads of cutouts and things. He was still like painting right up to the end of his life because he couldn't stop, but he couldn't move. Well, he was really disabled, so yeah.
He was just blind, wasn't he?
Yeah,
basically towards
yeah.
the end. So it's
No, but
interesting
like
relationship to that quote directly as a kind of
It
blind
is, yeah, that's
presence.
true. Yeah.
Sorry, were you talking about Monet or Mane?
Oh, sorry, did I say Monet? Yeah.
Yeah,
Monet, yeah.
because he was
Yeah.
thinking of
Yeah.
Monet,
Yeah.
and you were talking of Mane.
Yeah. Well done. Well spotted. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
But yeah, in fact, it's very interesting what you said about Monet being blind, because I've been looking at Degas' photographs, and he started photography when he was right at the end of his life, and he was going blind. So the colours he uses are just incredible. I've got one on here. And I saw this actually in London when they had Degas and the ballet exhibition, and it was huge, and it looks like this. And he was so blind that he saw colours completely differently, and he used all these sort of psychedelic
I need to
colours.
see it behind.
Which again is a very interesting point of thing, but I've kind of gone off the point of Barad. So the other bit I wanted to point out, but I think I did talk about this last week as well. I was
Well, wait,
talking
hold
to
on.
John.
Just before you jump to that, does anybody have a comment on
Yeah,
what we just saw? Yeah, Joe.
I think that quote is more about different bodies and what different bodies can do rather than the implements or the things.
The extended body.
Yeah, and I found that. Sorry, I found that a little bit irritating.
Bit what?
Partly because it's a bit middle class, but like. I mean, yeah, there's
You
that.
can call many things, but middle class
No, not
is one of them.
you, the clip. Because it's, yeah. Because I thought from where you were talking that he had a different body, and that's why he was using brushes in a different way. It's sort of this. I don't know if you read Flann O'Brien's The Third Policeman. He talks about how the body becomes sort of 70% bicycle if you.
Because that's a great
Yeah.
body.
And there's a kind of something similar there. But I think it's more about the different. The interesting thing is the different bodies and what different bodies do, rather than, for me, the implements.
Yeah, well, I've got a photo actually. I'll show you a Polaroid I took.
Could I just bracket that
Yeah.
quote? Merleau-Ponty's quote there, that relies from his later work, which really relies on the Lacanian underpinning of language and how things get coded into the body, how things become functional, and it builds on that very specific kind of linguistic encoding, which Mark B. N. Hansen wrote a book called Bodies in Code, which dealt with it. It's a rubbish book.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but it does it does talk about coding the body in a very specific way and how the unconscious is structured. And it gets very
So your
structures
view,
things in a very.
so your bracket comment about this to Sophie's or to Joe's comment, you're sort of falling on the side of what Joe is saying,
Yes.
or on the side of what Sophie was saying.
Probably more on Joe's side because Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is very built on this very structurally linguistic conception of code or embodiment, which
Okay, well, maybe I've got a better example then.
just as a footnote.
But you got the lights turned off, so this is good.
Well, I'll pass it round. But I took a Polaroid of my daughter who's sort of training to be a dancer, and it was in my dark room, and I've got an archway, and I asked her to interact with the building, with the archway, so she put her leg up high, because she's incredibly loose, and this is a photograph that I took, and I wasn't sure how it was going to come out, and it's a bit like the CCAR thing that Barad quotes, whereby there's a sort of accidental image, and it's almost like she's a kind of ghost in the lens, so you can just about work out her body, you know.
Yeah.
But I'll pass it round anyway. Because that's that sort of accidental production as well of an image.
So what I'm trying to what I think you need to just be a bit more clear on is because what I saw from that clip was that you were, and using Barad in it, was that you were trying to explain how the arguments that Barad is putting forward on extension, extensibility, and then the question of entanglement has a certain continuity or a certain discontinuity, and I don't know, while I can see that in this photo, I'm not sure what part of this you're trying to emphasize at the moment.
I think just the sort of embodiment and the entanglement, the sort of idea that you're not separate from the apparatus that you use, that yeah, that's it really.
Okay, that's interesting. Do you agree with that? Yeah.
I'm thinking a little bit more and on becoming, like it's not the kind of the video that I saw. Not only that it was exactly what was the kind of middle class.
You were also irritated.
Yeah, slightly irritated.
Was there anybody not irritated by that video? Okay, one person was not irritated.
I think I was more irritated by the sound, maybe something that like maybe that and him speaking about it and kind of in the middle. It's like, oh no, not in the middle again. But please stop being in the middle. There's no such thing to begin with. But but beside the point, I think it's the problem is that there is the method that the artist uses to paint. He chooses. He makes a decision of some sort. He extends his bodies by the brush and paints. In Barad, in the way Barad structures her kind of argument, that is not.
It's an undecidable.
Yeah. So his body, like, it's not about that there is him stick and a painting that suddenly happens. It's suddenly that through the interactions or through interactivity or how she calls it, this prosthesis emerges. So, for example, I look at my back of my work because as I'm taking, in my practice mostly, I take pictures of myself. So I am both in front of, behind, and around the camera, and it's all happening at the same time. And I'm talking about not only that the disruption of the ground itself happens because of multiplying, that you kind of lose the condition of self as that which gives meaning. So that's part of it, but also that this camera becomes a prosthesis, but it becomes prosthesis because of actions rather than it's assigned as that which is going to fulfill certain function. It gains the function. It's a kind of more livable entity
Hmm.
as such, and through that it kind of it becomes the sort of thing that is but is not there, you know. So it's
So that's entanglement because it is.
yeah,
it's
that's
not.
exactly. So there's a kind of disentanglement happening there, which I find. That's what I kind of find in relation to Barad, but I kind of said, yeah. But I'm still thinking, as much as you know, there's kind of difficulty I have there because it is the body in the image. Clearly, it's not blurred. It's not removed from its recognition as such.
Yeah.
Which that becomes a kind of problematic in not problematic, interesting, and like worth exploring when the body is not a representation in a sense. You know, that's a kind of question I have.
Okay, so your comment raises for me a connection to Coral's work and also Guy's scenario, because in Guy's work, Guy, would you say that the way in which you organize the sound with the tapes and so on and so forth, that is an entanglement, or is this kind of extension of the body,
Yeah, I think this is like.
or an embodiment? That's
Yeah, I think that was my question.
no, that was my question.
No, when I saw
That was my
video,
question.
I was thinking, what is embodiment and what's entanglement? How they are relating? Because it seems to be like there is a certain. As using that as a demonstration, then there is a sort of substitution between embodiment and entanglement. They kind of.
Well, yeah, we don't
concept.
want to have like flavor
And
of the month
but-
concept. Yeah.
Yeah, but that I think is problematic, and because there is my problem with the notion of embodiment is that it creates a sort of a kind of a closed romantic unit that kind of absorbs everything. But there is something in it that is also interesting because there is, and we talked about it once, I think, in Yaakov, but there is a certain distance also within embodiment. So it's not I don't think about it in the way that just like my body is just my body in that sense. And in that process of making those assemblages and also becoming part of the assemblage and also kind of eating the assemblage in some way. But because there are also other relations which will be called entanglement relation, then they also operate through certain eruptions and they create those tensions that kind of snap out of situation or you slow down or become heightened moving faster, and all those speed relations play part in this. And it sometimes brings it back to when Deleuze and Guattari speaks about Kafka, and when they kind of describe him, they restage him not as a writer but more like a machine of expression, they call it. And when they describe this machine, so Kafka is both the gears and the creator and the victim. So it's like, and that kind of, it's not a totality. It's just show like those kind of different relations that actually happening. So.
And that would be the intra-action you're thinking of,
yeah,
and not the embodiment.
Yeah.
And that's what I was thinking with your work, Coral, because the way in which you're opposing the fake one's the real, but you don't know which one's the fake, and so on and so forth. It is presented as an embodied unit, but goodbye. But in fact, it's an entangled.
Yeah.
So you never sit side saddle on a saddle. That's what that proves. Okay. Is this light too dull? No, everyone's fine except me. Okay, fine.
The conversation. What's the
Again, the diplomatic Alberto speaks.
No, I don't know what was the question.
No, I meant is the light too dull?
Ah, okay. Okay, sorry.
No, he's not. Okay, Simon, you were going to show something about entanglement and embodiment.
Yes.
Okay,
might need the lights on though.
Okay. Okay, never
So I
mind. We're
won't.
not getting the lights on yet.
So
Yeah.
can I just ask a quick, because sometimes there's sometimes I think of embodiment as that which becomes like a body. I don't know if I express myself.
No, because that's
No.
very descriptive. What do you mean exactly?
Embodiment which would describe a certain functionality of something that is not body but has a sensuality of a body. So it's that.
Okay, use a sentence. Make it in a sentence. Like how are you using embodied then?
Okay, 1 second. I'm just asking. That's what I'm asking because I'm just wondering here.
If something says this concept embodies X, Y, and Z,
Yeah.
what do you understand with that sentence?
It holds together.
Yeah, includes it
Yeah,
somehow.
yeah.
Yeah,
But
it may not be sensuous.
yeah. But
It may be.
Might be. But can we also talk? Oh, okay, that's fine.
The
Think
often
embodied
is
as a-
used, embodied in that word is used precisely not to say represents. By in those discourses in which representation and represent is a taboo word. So we need to be careful on that.
Can you explain a little bit more?
Well, the exact sentence you said, it was like this
X, Y, Z is
in-
embodied by blah blah blah.
or embodies blah blah blah.
Mm-hmm.
If one, I mean, I think anytime we tend to use, or we think about using that way of saying, we need to ask ourselves, is this embodiment the other term for represents? In that case,
Mhm.
are we happy with that? Like, could we write represent?
Well, in the example I gave, no, but in
No, but it's just
but
to
in
make
the
sure
example
that,
you're giving, I think that one could say embodied by which one means represent.
yeah, just
but-
to make sure that one doesn't just go away from a problem through just
Oh, yeah.
pretending that is not a problem. Also, another thing about but this is about entanglement. I think it's important to consider the fact that entanglement is not vagueness, in the sense that, and I was thinking that because although
Who suggested it was vagueness?
no, like nobody was directly suggesting that, but then I was thinking that there's a chance of getting into that. Not because I'm saying that the Polaroid that you showed was entangled because vague, but it was also vague, and that made me think that there's also an issue, because if we talk about entanglement and we criticize identity and we criticize clear cuts and distinction and stuff, doesn't mean that we want to go necessarily towards that is not fully formed, that is not fully determined, because those interactions, they actually are, they get their strength precisely in the precision, in the light precision in which they operate. So the vividness and the detail and the accuracy makes the entanglement be something more than fuzzy because non-accurate, non-analytic way of thinking, and it's really important to make
No,
sure
that's
that
very important. I'm glad you. Okay, I didn't take that from your Polaroid.
No, but I wasn't saying.
But I can understand. I can
I
understand.
wasn't saying
I
that
think it's a very
Polaroid was
important-
just that, but like
it is
because it
important.
was actually vague, I was just getting a bit suspicious.
Yeah, or worried. Yeah, I can see that. Mm-hmm. Your response?
Well, I don't think I was showing it as example of entanglement anyway. That wasn't really what I was saying.
Okay. No, just because I understood that you that's what you were doing, because you showed that after trying to frame the entanglement through the video. That's just what I understood.
No, it was more interacting with the environment that she was in. And
So,
like
what would
becoming-
be the difference between an interaction and an entanglement? You don't have to be the only one that answers this. Did anybody have a? Carl, you looked up at the wrong time.
Well,
between interaction and entanglement then? Or intra-action?
So intra is to come, oh god, from something internally. So it's, I think an interaction implies. I'm trying to frame it without it sounding like it's two separate bodies, because it's, so in a way it's linked to, it is linked to entanglement, but interaction implies some sort of phenomenon, something kind of.
So close.
Yeah.
Anybody?
I would say it's
Yep.
the same thing.
Okay, so then what Sophie's response was
Was not, you know.
was not enough.
She isn't.
That's right. There it is, our diplomat in waiting for a long time, like Godot. Okay. What then? Okay, this is my concern last week was that we left the seminar without understanding fully what this thing called entanglement was. And I think maybe we need to revisit that then, because the intra-action and the entanglement are not the same thing. So the question is, what is the difference and what is the, I mean, they can be like in concentric circles, they can like cross over and have similar fields.
I think interaction speaks to her notion of space, time and matter.
Okay, and how does it do that?
Because she talks about reconfiguring space, time and matter as being so that you can have like two phenomena at the same time.
Okay, so the simultaneity thing comes
Yeah.
on. It's painful. Okay.
I would say that interaction is the paradigm of the entanglement. So
Okay, but that's different.
okay, so it's different, but entanglement doesn't make sense without a paradigm of interaction, because entanglement.
That's true.
So I was just oversimplifying.
That's also true.
Yeah.
But I don't mean that in a nasty way, seriously. I mean, entanglement, I really don't feel like telling, I don't want to yet tell you this, but I'm going to tell you this because we've spent 4 hours now on this word. Entanglement has to do with the way in which a dimension or a surface is established. The intra-action, you could say, is the paradigm around which names the kind of environments that set that up. However, the entanglement isn't like two bodies coming together, it's two dimensions.
Mm-hmm.
It's the surface. That's why I wanted you to show your surface, your RH thing.
Crystals.
Well, can you play the thing first?
Yeah, sure.
Because this
Do you want the?
No, it's just sound.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if anyone saw the paper from a colleague who was looking at the relationship between objects and the environments in the museum, and these let's call it. Hold on a second. Anyway, so Boris Pretzel, the chief scientist, very kindly last night got to me. Oh, this is the sound of the new surfaces.
Wait, can you start that again? Sorry. Just give a bit more to it.
A bit more. You want a bit more. So the concern is that the galleries where they're putting furniture are not suitable for furniture. But there isn't enough money, and it's a very old building, so they can't actually condition the space so that it is climatically suitable for the furniture. So what they're trying to measure is what are the effects of fluctuations in temperature and humidity on the furniture in the gallery. So it's an analysis project. And they approached it two ways. One was with spectral analysis to actually videographic, I can't remember the term now, to try and actually look at the surface of the furniture and see what's happening. The other approach was to place very sensitive microphones in the gallery very close to the objects in question, and to record possibly the sound of what my colleague calls the energy given off by new surfaces appearing in the furniture. And this is a sample. I have all the sound files, but they had to sample them in order to make it that we wouldn't sit here for an hour and a half to wait for one.
So this is like speeded up time of some kind.
Yeah. Ooh. What have I done with it?
It's a race to us.
Trash. Trash bin.
That's right.
Okay.
To me, it sounds like someone's trying to get out. It's like-
It's like someone is hitting the pipes in the
Yeah.
basement.
That's right.
You're like, we have rats. Well, in a good way. But that's I kind of talking about interaction and like entanglement with that. Like even me saying like, oh, we have rats. If we think what happened, I listened to that noise. I didn't listen, but it was the event of the noise, and suddenly I became person with the rats because there was a cat of like this and that because of interaction.
Okay, I have really lost you. I don't
Okay.
know. Sorry about that. Can
Okay.
you try that again with the cat and the rat and the hat?
No, cat and the rat. It's a rat. So I became a person with the rats. Yeah, because of that. In a way, because of.
Okay, so while you're sitting there, you become thinking about the person in the basement banging on the thing
Yeah.
because there's a rat
Yeah, so I
or rats.
in a sense, I got the sense of identity of someone who hears the rats in the base through the pipes. So I got the identity, but I didn't have that before that happened. So that would be interaction, yeah. And later, because now I have that identity of some sort, it kind of gets the grounding, and that is the sound of something of I don't remember exactly what it was, of not rats doing it, but also it became a sound of rat hitting the pipes. Yeah, so it became a sound of the rat hitting the pipes, which is another identity.
But of course, it isn't the sound of the rats hitting the
Oh yeah, let's say it's not, but something else. Let's say that, and suddenly we have individuals, and then they entangle it and become and live in its space-time mattering or in a dimension in which, and it creates a dimension in which rats hit the pipes in the basement. So there becomes a dimension here, and that when that dimension becomes materializes or becomes space-time mattering, that will be entanglement rather than interaction.
Dane, what do you think about that?
Am I right? I don't think I'm right.
I would say that the crack is an interaction because it emerges from let's say the agencies of the environment, the material, and that interaction creates a different kind of mattering, and those agencies are still entangled. They produce phenomena, and those agencies are still, they're not ontologically separate. They're contained in the making of the crack, the surface, as a surface event, let's say. And those continue to operate. They're still entangled as they're still reconfiguring the surface, as they're still making.
So the interaction is kind of like the consequence, or it's like the product, as it were. Is that what you're saying? Like the surface?
No.
No.
Because phenomena aren't effects of difference or mattering. It's mattering that creates difference.
So the mattering that creates difference is the entanglement. Yes. And then if the mattering is that which creates, if the mattering is the entanglement that creates difference, the difference that is created is the interaction. Is that what you're making? Is that the claim you're making? Is that what you were saying?
Can I read? It's from her interview in the Moose magazine
Oh, yeah.
from 2012.
What
The-
page?
It's the page, well, 77 from the magazine, but there is a PDF somewhere, and I think it's on PDF page.
Oh, no, that's right. No, just
Yeah. The usual notion of interaction, so we're talking about interaction.
interaction.
Yeah, the traditional word, not her queer word. Yeah, interactions assumes that there are individual, independently existing entities or agents that pre-exist the acting upon one another. So that's our traditional ontology in a sense. There is one that acts upon the other, and there is a
Like interdisciplinary.
yes, exactly.
Mhm.
By contrast, the notion of intra-action, which is intra-action, queers the familiar sense of causality, where one or more causal agents proceed and produce an effect. Yeah, so suddenly we don't have cause-effect anymore; it's something else. And more generally, unsettles the metaphysics of individualism. But that's if we apply that to a social, political kind of structure of what we have. According to my gentle realist ontology, or rather ethical ontoepistemology, an entanglement, and she calls it entanglement of what is usually taken to be a separate considerations of ethics, ontology, and epistemology, individuals do not pre-exist as such, but rather materialize in interaction.
Action, yeah.
Intra-action.
Mhm.
That is, interaction goes to the question of making of differences of individuals rather than assuming their independent or priori existence.
Okay.
Yeah.
So far, and so then what is the entanglement?
Later on, she writes about space-time matterings,
Okay.
and she says with diffraction patterns dispersed across differently entangled space and time, or other space-time matterings. So, entanglement can produce different dimension as such,
Mm-hmm.
can produce different sense of time, space, and what is the matter with the matter.
Mm-hmm.
What the
Yeah.
matter with the matter. While interaction allows for those entanglements to happen when one sees the other, when the other becomes something, when there is the other.
But in Leibniz's term,
Yeah.
the compossible, be careful because it's not like one predates the other. They're,
Yeah,
they're
that's right.
simultaneous.
Yeah, it's all kind of happens. There is no one leads to another, because that would be
The Newtonian move.
a Newtonian move, yeah, cause effect, but rather it all kind of how to say it? It's a lightning kind of thing. It's a
Okay, try it again. You're very close then, because so just so we are clear on the interaction, intra-action, and entanglement.
okay.
So from what?
Can I try?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead. You go ahead. You go.
So, going from from how she was starting by talking about interaction, we could say that interaction could be the paradigm of Newtonian physics, classic ontology, whereas interaction is the paradigm of the whatever Barad talks about, which could be considered by someone another kind of ontology, but also could be considered something that is too different from classical ontology to be considered an ontology. And entanglement is the mattering. So it's and this mattering is the units of this mattering are surfaces, dimensions, phenomena. These things are the equivalent but absolutely different from the bricks that are the identities upon which you build the system of interference of classical conception of ontology and physics and everything.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I say something? That Simon's recording is like an updated version of Traject. I don't know if anybody went to the cathedral and saw that work was on your door. In fact, I'll show you because it's
Sorry.
No, but it's really interesting.
You mean that wrong?
Daniel Hinchcliffe's
Daniel,
project, isn't it?
yeah,
That was because where's the picture? Can I take it off?
Yeah.
Because she worked with a geologist who was there, and they talked about the way they made these seismic recordings, and they were recording space that used to be a shopping mall underneath the ground, and the artist Jane happened to walk past when they were filling it in, and she said, "What are you doing?" And they said they were just filling in this space, and so she was really interested in recording that space which had been taken away, kind of thing. So she worked with this geologist who was very interesting actually, and this is what they produced was these seismic shifts, if you like.
Yeah.
And then they translated that into music, which was really fascinating.
It's a
and
shame. Yeah.
It was a really, really good piece. I unfortunately took my 11-year-old son, who just squirmed the whole way through it, and I had to sort of hold him back, and he wanted to get his phone out, and he said it was the most boring hour he'd ever spent.
In his life,
yeah.
in his young life of 11 years.
Yeah, making him go to art.
Okay, so let's try and pull this together again, because now with Dane, Jakob, Sophie, and Alberto, say again what you said, and then see if the three of you can build on that, because this is correct how you phrased it. Can you remember what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Can you say it so people can jump in and see how it relates to what they're doing, and it also, Simon, what you just presented. So go on.
So on the one hand, there's a classical ontology with identity, the principle of the paradigm of interference, and the paradigm of reflection we can also add. On the other hand, there's this other thing which could be considered an alternative ontology, but maybe it's so different, so incommensurably different from classical ontology that might be called in a different way, could be claimed that it's not an ontology at all. And that is built on the paradigm of interaction, and we can also say of diffraction instead of reflection. And it is constituted, or let's say it can be divided potentially into what we can call phenomena or surfaces or dimensions. And those are the equivalents, although they are absolutely ontologically different from the identities, which are the bricks upon which you build everything according to the common way of thinking.
So what's the difference then between dimension? Sorry. Two questions. One is, how are you using diffraction, because you threw that in, and the other is, what's the difference between reflection and refraction? Or reflection and diffraction. Don't use refraction. But
okay, so yeah.
Because that's very important in this whole story.
What's the difference between reflection and diffraction?
Yes.
Yeah. So.
You kind of threw that in, and
well, I threw that in because
it's important.
Somehow it's a bit the equivalent of this difference between interference and interaction, because interference sees pre-existent things that interfere with each other and might create something, but that would be in a dialectical way.
Yes, good.
And these paradigms are reflective in the sense that all these lines, all this connection, they are bonding together things that exist independently. In the same way in which you exist and the mirror exists before the image of you on the mirror. So that is also a reflection. Whereas diffraction is truly interaction in the sense that it's not built on pre-existing things, and the result is not dialectical, because it really produces something on a different dimension, and not just something that is a sort of a compromise of the entities that we're producing it.
Okay, yes.
So what is
Hello, Andrew.
produced when Johnny sees herself in the mirror then?
What?
What is produced is an image.
It's very frightening.
It's a representation.
Oh my God.
No, if you understand it as a diffractive move.
Oh no, but I wasn't. I was talking about the mirror.
I know, but the mirror is still
in,
there.
in the reflexive way.
I know,
Yeah.
but what happens if you are in this paradigm of diffraction and you stand in front of the mirror?
Well, then you cannot say what happens in those terms because you're framing the problem in the reflective way. But in the diffractive way, you would start by saying that there is this image, and then maybe in a second moment there might be Johnny taking
Now. No.
I don't know, like recognizing herself or recognizing the mirror to be a mirror or like reflecting upon it. But the first bit is this sensuous quality of the image, and then all the other consideration come after. So.
But I say this very respectfully, but that is asking a different kind of question and then requiring a different form of the answer. So, for example, in setting up an identity, the question is around the notion of the reflection of or the self-reflective way in which a unity can be made into, a synthesis can be made into a unity. Hence, it's referred to as a mirror. So you have like the thesis, antithesis. You have the ways in which the one side is quote reflected back to the other. It's not like if I actually look in a mirror, I don't see myself. I mean, unless I'm a vampire or something, which is very possible at this point. But it's that I will still see myself. I'll see myself reflected back to me. But that isn't about the question of how meaning is constructed or how identity is constructed. It's a different ball game that's going on. So you're talking about a different way in which the meaning gets established in this way that has more than one dimension to it, is what's going on there.
I understand. It's just that I try to understand what meaning is then coming out if you work in this diffractive thinking, yes, or you tune yourself in this diffractive mode.
Mm-hmm.
But in that
You're still
case,
in the same situation in a way that you have this mirror, you have yourself, and I do get the jump of getting this of getting those entities in a construction that is something else than a representation of something you can't define or you wouldn't define as an identity, but something is going on, and what's the output? I mean, what is the question then different, or what is different? What does it? What's the use of being attuned in
This one's the
diffraction?
answer. Jakob.
There is again in this interview, because I find this interview much more sexy. But
Much more sexy, did you say?
sexy to read. She uses the word queer a lot, which I like. But the other thing is, I have very low expectations from people. So it's like queer somewhere I'm with. But there is a kind of she talks about diffraction and why is she using diffraction as a method. So she writes, I like to get page 77. It's the same page. It's interview, but it's page 2nd. I like to get in there and do diffraction experiments. That is, to get my hands dirty and experiment with differences, trying to get a feel for how differences are produced and how they matter. Reading insights through one another diffractively is about experimenting with different patterns of I can't pronounce it. Relationality. There you go. Opening things up, turning them over and over again to see how the patterns shift. This is not about solving paradoxes or synthesizing different points of view from the outside as it were, but rather about the material implication of putting oneself at risk, troubling oneself, one's ideas, one's dreams, all the different ways of touching and being in touch, the sensing the differences and entanglements from within.
So translate that.
I read it as in relation, for example, to queer, I kind of read it in relation to what queer is, and there is Judith Butler in the she writes Gender Trouble. She writes that queer needs to be, I'm paraphrasing now because I don't remember exact quote, but in order for it to stay valid or like influential, produce something, it needs to be constantly renegotiated. It needs to be the and of, instead of this and that, but and another.
A and D.
A and D.
Not E and D.
Not E.
Yeah,
Not and
and.
as in stop, but like A and D.
Plus,
yeah.
plus, plus, yeah.
Plus, plus, plus. It needs to be plus, plus, plus. Otherwise, it will lose this instability of some sort, the kind of non-completeness, the kind of excess or whatever we kind of think about it. It needs to stay constantly remade and remade and remade and remade, and then in a way that's relatable to diffraction and as a method of thinking, instead of trying to find a cause for the problem. So there is a problem, and that there is a way of solving it, right? So instead of finding the truth and the meaning or revealing something that's going to come out and make sense out of it all, it's about figuring out, it's about thinking, here this is happening, and like molding it up, there is this happening, molding it up, and all kind of entangles together basically, and entangles here in a kind of more connected, multiple
Did that help you?
way.
And it's making difference from within, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Good.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah, excellent.
And constantly making it, like never, like you do never.
Has
stop.
anybody
You
ever
can
listened?
stop.
What?
Sorry. It's not constantly making it because you can stop it.
It's about
If you
when
lose
I'm,
the
yeah,
the
it's
potential.
about keeping it unsettled. That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
This is the
so
important thing.
when I'm talking about making is about keeping it unsettled. Never. Like, that's it. That's it. Like,
This is where I think everybody, if you haven't done so, and I don't know how you've been in this country, but if you should have a moment to listen to the shipping forecast on BBC at various hours. In the shipping forecast, one of the things that's fabulous about it is that it says things like winds going at 5 knots, losing its identity at 3 knots. And I just love that. I just think that it's rainy, but then will be sometimes sunny, followed by a loss of identity in blah blah blah. And this is very much a diffractive way of talking about how something could then, you never end the weather, you're never outside of the weather, it just takes on these different positionalities. Hello.
And that
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
That is literally.
Kirsten, you can
Take my seat.
change. Oh, you can sit down. What was it?
That is literally the reason why Bohm speaks of atmosphere,
Yes.
and why atmosphere belongs to this either from classical ontology.
And that's what we were talking about today in your tutorial, Paul. Yeah, excellent.
Also, this thing about keeping things unsettled could be understood in two ways, because the settledness could be the recognition, like the defined recognition, which is like the goal and the thelos of the hermeneutic paradigm. But then there are two ways not to get things settled for good. One would be like a before settledness, which would be this sensuous level in which you avoid to recognize. But then there can be also the exploding of that, like to make that process of recognition explode, go out of control, and that would be the renvoi in Derrida, which is to keep going, not be satisfied with the limit of that identity, and see through the constructive move how everything always reminds of something else. There's always a resemblance. There's always a line of resemblance that goes.
Which is what you were saying with the rats.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry.
is that about responsibility in Barad? To keep that
Response
disequilibrium
dash ability, yeah.
is to keep that meta state or that disequilibrium alive.
I think
in
it
order
could
for-
be, but in your work, for example, what you just showed with the RH report, can you translate what Alberto was saying into that report? Forget about Barad at this moment, but like what would be the stability aspect of it? What would be the instability aspect of it? I mean, I might be asking the question in a too difficult way to enter it, but part of the discussion that I think Andrea has pointed up is that one doesn't just start at somewhere and then go somewhere. One's always in it.
Mm.
And so even in this report, this RH report, you're still coming into a current of some kind. And so the question is that current that you're coming into and the way in which then the cracks form different axes into that being in the flow, to use Stuart's blog. So you're in this flow, but then you have these like segments that come in, and they come in as dimensions. They don't come in as a foot, or as a, Godzilla meets Bambi kind of moment where you just crush it. It comes in as these kind of slanted, which is why it can lose identity but then gain it in some other point. Were you going to say something, Andrea? Oh no, I'm sorry, I just thought you were moving in this sort of way. Okay. Emily, how are we doing back there?
Yeah, I feel like I'm following today, but I'm just not of any use.
Okay, so you don't want to be picked on today?
No.
Okay.
And could I
Neither do you.
maybe I actually have a question.
Okay.
Simon, could you maybe explain because in the museum world, if I'm not totally mistaken, you would have this divide into the material side and in the discursive side. Could you maybe explain of how this is actually materialized in documents, or in what kind of forms can you keep those two things separated, or and what would be the difference in looking at this particular phenomena? How would this come
if
together?
You could keep that, I don't actually think you can keep them separate.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Which is why I'm here and what I'm interested in.
I know.
But within the bigger phenomena of a museum,
Mm-hmm.
they very much do keep them separated.
And could you
But in the paper they don't keep it separate.
What?
In that paper, what was interesting is they do not keep it separate in the sense that the way that they make the assessment is already built on a previous discourse around the effect of humidity on different types of woods, and I think there's something interesting in the texture of that recording, which is and that's kind of the hiss part of it, that it's situated in those cracks are situated in this kind of hiss, and it tells me something about the way that, and that also corresponds to the way they describe the procedure that we're doing in the assessment, because the trouble, as I understood it, was that they put a very sensitive microphone to the surface, and then it basically picks up a lot of things. So how do you define the noise of the crack? So that they had to use some, and then that's where the whole discourse comes in. So they had to use a certain filtering. So they have to kind of envelope the recording into an area which will then become the area of the crack. And then they listen to it for some time, and then when they identify it, they mark, okay, here's the crack. And I think this enveloping is probably what's also create this hiss. So it's kind of the tension, because the envelope is, I think, creating an intensity of it puts up this volume very high, but all the other stuff is not really being erased. It just becomes this hiss, which is like this environment. And if you actually listen closely, you can hear probably the differences of this movement.
That's about attunement, isn't it?
Yeah.
Really.
Mm-hmm.
And what tends to get pulled out from these are pragmatics of, we need to sort this problem out. This becomes a concern, but not a concern that we might be interested in exploring, but a concern about there are very short, we don't have the budget. We need to be able to borrow other people's furniture and put it in our gallery, and we have to guarantee we can kind of almost do what we like to our furniture because it's ours, but somebody else isn't going to lend their furniture. If they look at the graphs and they see these high temperature and humidity, they're going to say, oh, we need more data than that. So I think that really is about a particular way of framing a concern. And what I'm interested in is other ways of framing that concern, perhaps. And the object is the concern, in some ways, the object. But that probably doesn't answer the question, your question, about how they keep those things separate. Say the material or the encounter or the kind of contrasts that we might pick up from that recording, and actually what it. I mean, to be fair to to Boris, in his email to me, he said probably is the sound of. So it's framed in in particular ways, but it's when you read it, you're right. There is quite a nice texture to it. I mean, I think he does have a very keen sensibility. Obviously, for materials, it's his job, and for the kind of the cracks or what falls in between the cracks of having to produce a paper like this.
Yeah, but it also brings in the whole question of the apparatus.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and that comes back to measurement in some ways, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. But the question then is, what type of measurement? How are we measuring this encounter, this? And there, I think it's important to think about the notion of simultaneity question.
Well, that brings in the rats.
Yes.
The pipes.
And the rats.
Yeah, Mark.
The contraction that produces the sound is the same size as expansion, isn't it? Because by contracting, which creates, I'm guessing it's drying out that creates the sound. Is this correct?
It's both. It's very complicated with furniture because you'll have multiple layers. You can have a painted layer. You can have the deformations that already exist in the wood itself. So it much prefers to crack along the grain than across the grain. So they're a bit like photographs. They're very complicated materially. So whether you're hearing these kind of surfaces just moving over each other, I think he does allude to that in the paper.
Okay. Can we turn the light on so we can watch your little experiment?
So when I first saw this, I got very taken by this sort of sub-heading of RH events. I've been looking a lot at the time of the work of Gilbert Simondon, the French philosopher who was working in the late 50s, early 60s, whose work was a great influence on Deleuze. And Simondon uses a notion that he calls transduction. And that is to try and think being as becoming, or being as becoming, and individuation as never, well, as a process of becoming. And he uses the notion, one of the schema he uses is the process of crystallization. And so I went to see Boris to ask him whether he would consider my own experiments with crystallization thought alongside his own analysis. I don't know if you've made crystals before. It's very good fun. This is one that was made by the Premier Inn in their breakfast bar. They make very nice crystals. So I can pass those on that way. You want another way? So to make a crystal, you need first to create this potential. So in sugar crystals, you melt as much sugar as you can, that it still stays liquid, but it becomes a saturated solution. And for Simondon, this is what he calls metastability. And then you need to bring into this, so what I was saying to Boris is, could the gallery be this metastable non-equilibrium, or at the point of tipping over into non-equilibrium because of the fluctuations in temperature and humidity? And then what you do when you make a sugar crystal is you introduce another element, which can be a string or stick, or for Boris it's possibly his listening device and the furniture. So now you have two, sorry, I've got it I did write it down for you, but I thought I'd try and get away with not looking at my notes, which I can't do.
Would you say metastability is similar to superposition?
I didn't want to get there yet. But I would like
that's
to
where
talk,
we need to get.
I would like to
That's
talk
where we need to
about
get to.
that,
Okay.
if that is
Yeah.
possible. I didn't want to dare. Thank you, Dave, because I thought I'd be really treading on thin crystals. So, okay, to make crystals, so for Simondon, he employs this physical process. He goes back to the physical sciences that he's very interested in, and he's trying to rethink the relation between individual, which say is the furniture, and its environment, which would be the gallery. And he calls this environment the associated milieu, and I'm going to use the middle word again, sorry. But for Simondon, milieu is a technical term, and it uses the French double meaning of milieu as both the middle and the surroundings or habitat. So there's no outside to this phenomenon. Once you introduce what he calls the structural seed, or the piece of furniture or object or listening device, there isn't anything actually I can do now to make individuation, to make a crystal happen. That is totally to do with the relationship between the structural seed and the metastable disequilibrium of the melted sugar. And there are four parameters for Simondon's scheme. There's the seed, the supersaturated solution, the crystal that forms, and the less saturated solution. And this comes back that actually you can stop individuation happening. You can either remove this from the relation that it's in with its associated milieu, and the crystal will stop growing, or if the metastable solution loses its metastability, which I think, for me, I think about Barad and this idea of responsibility, and the responsibility really is to keep these conditions alive so that these processes of individuation, or what Simondon calls transduction, can happen. And what's happening is this structuring. So non-equilibrium thermodynamics, and this is what Simondon was interested in, is saying that there are too many states that are continuously and discontinuously subject to flux of matter and energy to and from other systems. So if the conditions are right, the introduction of the structural seed sets in motion the process of crystallization. And that event is triggered, the eventfulness is triggered by putting into relation these two distinct entities. And Simondon refers to these two distinct entities as orders of magnitude. However, as I've just said, individuation is not a pre-given. And in the afterword to this, there isn't there aren't many translations of Simondon because of his estate. So unfortunately, I'm reading a lot in translation, but this is a really fantastic book if you're interested in kind of what I'm talking about here.
Can you say the title?
It's Gilbert Simondon and the Philosophy of the Trans Individual. So, where should I go with this? So there's a trigger that happens, and I think this is really important for what we've just been saying. But the trigger is so small, Thomas Lamar says in his afterword to the book, that we might never be able to identify or isolate it properly or precisely. It is then in abstract terms a point, and Brian Masumi styles it as a neutral point that starts the event of crystallization. But importantly, the event is part of the event, not outside of it. The event is physically inside the crystal, continuous with its structure, and at the same time, just as the stick remains distinct from the crystals that form upon it, its neutral point is equally outside the crystal, not separable but also not blurred. And for me, this resonates with this idea of Barad's agential realism. And perhaps we could think of that as a phenomenon, that each structure here is an interaction. That what's going on here is an entanglement, and that each molecular structure of spacing and contrast is an interaction within the phenomenon. So, in Simondon writes, each molecular layer already constituted serves as a structuring base for the layer in the process of forming. Transduction expresses this operative processual sense of individuation. And if the conditions are felicitous, then there's a release of energy, which is one of the structuring layers of the crystal. And Simondon was a big influence on Deleuze, and in Anne Sauvagnar's book, she talks about distillation in Simondon, and she says that Deleuze thought a mode of individuation that is precisely not confused with a thing or a subject, which Deleuze turns into a discordant harmony, which I think is a really lovely way of thinking what's going on here. So it's a non-linear system of surface and spacing. And then for me, what I'm finding interesting with Simondon's work is that he also questions Bohr's attention to the human in measurement, much like Barad does. Where is it? So Barad says the defect here lies in the lesion of the role of power in the very constitution of the subject. In both cases, the offending humanist elements are linked to a failure to account for the practices through which boundaries are produced, including an examination of how the constitutive exclusions of boundary-making practices matter. That's on page 168 to 169. And the problem with Bohr for both Simondon and Barad, as Barad says, and he's very similar in this, is he's too attentive to the production of non-human phenomena and takes for granted the prior existence of a human observer. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That this phenomena is, it doesn't need a human observer to be interacting. But what Simondon does that I'm very interested in and looking at is he doesn't post or transhuman the human. For him, the human is very much there, and he states that these ensembles or technical ensembles can be thought of fields of rationality that assume and prolong equality indifference between humans and between humans and machines. And I'm suggesting that this is a form of machine. Suggesting that this is what machines might do with us. And for me that comes back to this ethicality in Barad and the idea of being accountable and responsible. And she writes, each moment is alive with different possibilities for the world's becoming and different reconfigurings of what may yet be possible. And I think Simondon is saying that the human's job is to keep this conditions alive, this metastability. So.
John, what do you think about this? How does it reflect, or what do people think about what? Because that I think is a very important. Yeah, Mark.
What's fascinating? What's interesting? For my schoolboy geology, I remember crystals have formation. The shape is called habit, isn't it? It's the habit. Crystal habit. So if they're cubic or orthogonal, these kind of things, they're described as crystal habits, the way that they're. I mean, in this entangled world, in Sophie's quote, they talked about habit expressing our power dilating or being in the world. Deleuze in chapter 2 of repetition and different repetition, he talks about chapter 2 in Deleuze repetition and difference. He talks about repetition. He talks in chapter 2 repetition in itself. He talks about habits, people's habits being a contraction. There's this whole idea where in your presentation when you showed the film of this idea of a kind of Heideggerian idea of ready at hand, this kind of this kind of habit, this idea of contracting and expanding. There's just this notion that the way that this then appears in your presentation, in this idea of the way that something acquires a habit. We have a habit forming as a sort of notion of dimension change. I don't know if the entangled dimensions has anything to do with the chronos and aeon of a Deleuzian kind of logic of sense, whether that can stand in as an idea of the entangled that you have simultaneously the chronos and the ion at the same time as two different dimensions.
That's a very good point.
Whether that stands in good stead. But I've been fascinated by this whole idea of habit, and then to find it appearing in your work here and then in Simon's work here. To me, it's a kind of a diffraction process. One is talking from that point of view, one's talking from this point of view, and it's those two ways combining together and then collapsing on myself that keeps me interested, or something like that. So
that's very interesting. Does that resonate with what you're doing?
It resonates with that paper as well, about hapticality and habit. Talk about it.
Because that would be part of your work too, I think, Stuart. This the question of how the habit, as it were, operates. The haptic of the habit.
It's also like the contemplation of something, which is part of what Deleuze talks about, the habit. It's kind of like the complementary. You cannot be thinking and thinking about thinking. She talks about, Barad talks about in the complementary example. And also the contemplation is also what Kant calls, in his judgment of taste, that is the notion of the beautiful in the contemplation. It's the contemplation beautiful. It's not the agreeable, which is has an inclination. So there's again these old notions of contracting and expanding, which
it kind of goes back to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle as well, doesn't it? Because he was saying that he didn't know why he went to Copenhagen, that he could only tell by somebody else's reaction.
So that would be like the idea of that he has to do. You have to perform the action. You can't. There's another thing that's interesting in what you just said. In the movement of Hegel's consciousness and self-consciousness, there's no reason why they should be able to move, if except in the actual performance of the act itself. Because if you had a set of concepts that stood outside the movement, into an intellectualist understanding, then wouldn't give reason enough. It has to be performed, and then you feel guilty or whatever, because you wouldn't work on that. But this, I think that's what you're saying, the idea of a complementary relation. It's this performance. Again, you can stand outside the performance, but the performance comes first, the action comes first. Activity, the doing is the, which is, again, it points back to your lovely presentation of the guy at work.
To build on that, I think, in another Deleuzean sense, when Deleuze talks about the aleatory points in series 10 of the logical sense and somewhere in Dickens' repetition, it's near the end, how to talk about how a throw of the dice isn't just or as an event, like putting the seed into the solution isn't just throwing an element of randomness in, it's fragmenting things in such a way which distributes singularities on the surface, and those in Barad, the agential cut allows singularities to be distributed in certain ways as well. So I think it sort of relates to those as well. I try to point it as a point which does some sort of distributing in some way that allows some crystallization to occur.
And I think he's very clear that you can never get, as you were saying a couple of weeks ago, the idea of the question of getting back to the source of the Big Bang is a false question. You can't return to that point of eventfulness, that initial point of eventfulness. It all gets very, very blurry. You just can't get near it.
How about the group that is very quiet at the couch? Any comments? James, you want to give you a stab at this? No. Sorry. Girl?
I think in terms, I'm quite interested in what, because we'd sort of come from museums but in two different kind of aspects. So
yeah.
I'm quite interested in what you're saying, because you're very much engaged with the scientific, where I'm engaged more in interpretation, to use a museum sort of word. But I have been thinking a lot this week about, if because I think a museum space is quite interesting, because it's kind of like this weird, it's a virtual space and it is a highly experimental space, and we're taking quite everyday objects and that, but they're highly charged, and they're all very charged with materiality and also meaning. And I was kind of musing on this idea of, a quantum museum, which
interesting,
because a museum is, in a sense, a quantum museum is kind of an oxymoron, isn't it? Because a museum is entirely to do with things being linear, and it's how we understand, it's to do with chronology. But to have, so if you sort of took this store and tried to think about it on a quantum level, and think about, and then also it's further than that, because it's the stuff you're doing about how I guess objects get broken down, I guess, to understand matter as something, complicated and layered, and then sort of that this constant phenomena and constant newness and constant becoming, and then taking objects that are, I guess, I think about as in stability. We talk a lot about in museums, but it's actually constant becoming, and that relates to meaning making as well, because every new sort of set of eyes is a becoming. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been musing on. But then I realised I've been sitting still, staring into space for an hour, and but it's also because I was thinking like last week with this line between the laptop, and so I've been scanning objects to be put into this digital visual museum database, and I was thinking about because there literally is a wire that goes from the laptop to the scanner to the object. But also about how that object is kind of realising a new meaning, because it's then broken up into surfaces where a laser intersects it, and it becomes multiple points, and then the computer tries to equate that to surface. But then also, by me doing it and making certain decisions about settings, but then also about trying to fuse models together to make something complete, I'm becoming part of this becoming, and then how to my decisions are, not me, literally, and then trying to sort of, I'm trying to find the right words, sort of make like that role in it, kind of not justify it. I'm trying to think of a better word, but I can't. But yeah, so it's because that new surface, even though it might be literally a literal sort of what that object is, it isn't literal at all. It's actually become something completely different in its representation. Yeah.
Good, all the way up to that last little bit, but I'm not sure where you're going with that part. But
Yeah.
let's circle back to, if you could, I mean, maybe we need one more intervention, which would either be Guy, you talking about your work, Dane, you talking about your work, or Stuart, you talking about your work, or Jamo. Because the people at the very back then don't want to talk about their work at the moment. To follow on with what Coral's saying. Or does it not? Yeah.
Well, after my grilling about what the object is in my supervisory meeting, maybe we could just sit down for an hour or two and actually try and define what an object is in a museum. Because I feel that might be quite an important step for both of us. But that's an aside from what we're doing here. It's
Okay.
that word.
That object word.
That object word.
But wouldn't it be interesting, or
Yeah. In fact, yeah, definitely.
wouldn't it be more interesting to question actually not what the object is, but what the practice is to define the object? In the way of, like you're saying, exactly what you're doing, like making up this particular space between you, the computer, the object, and exactly this materialization of what's in front of you and what's possible through that. And to understand, because that's the way you practice, and to get to the core of that.
I think it's something that within it's many layers. It's not as simple as defining what an object is or what that specific practice is, because it depends. I guess it depends what you're trying to do. So I think it's that in that sense of a constant becoming, a constant. It's something that I think museums are quite complicated spaces because of that. Because there isn't, there is a lot of different function. How I see them is probably quite different from possibly how Simon. If we walked around the same space, you'd probably have a completely different conversation with both of us.
Ajami, you want to jump in?
Not at the moment.
What is it that's stopping people who aren't jumping in from jumping in? Is the conversation just leaving you sort of in your sleep, just leaving you in the dust? I mean, because we need to all sort of get on top of this. Did you get lost at diffraction, at entanglement, at 10 minutes after 4? I mean, yeah.
Could Dane say something about superpositionality or even diffraction in relation to the crystals?
So, you think of superposition as a combination of waves, let's say, two waves interacting with one another.
Mhm.
And so they become the same wave, they occupy the same space at the same time. And because of that, the matter that it produces through a diffraction experiment or whatever can't be traced back to a cause effect, because of the superposition means that they're in the same space, that they're patterning difference, they create patterns of difference through diffraction. At the same point, you can't separate them at that point. In relation to the crystal, I suppose. It's tricky.
Isn't the clue in the fact that, like I said, it's this contraction is what they call a habit, crystal habit. Then that produces a shape, and then the crystals continually produce the same shape. That's the point, isn't it? They're either one shape, and they're either cubic or orthogonal, things like this. But the shape is then repeated over and over again. It's always that shape. The crystal habit is always the same. They don't produce multiple shapes. It's always that shape, and it's sort of this. The elements come together and it collapses into that superposition, something like that.
So would you say a superposition then is somehow connected with or sorry, differently, how is superposition connected to entanglement then? Versus interaction?
I think one of my photos, actually, from what you were saying, might be a superpositionality, because it's multiple exposure. I think I took 4 or 5 in this. And you can almost see the body, but not quite. She's disguised in the lights and the movement and the dance, if you like.
So you're saying the superpositionality is what's it called? Superimposed in the same thing.
No, not necessarily the same thing. But just that within that one photo there exists lots of elements of time.
That's superimposed.
No, I don't think so. I think it's...
No, not that. Like, superimposed at different times.
Yeah.
It's a super, what's in English? Superimposition. So what's the difference? Because I think it's important to frame the difference between the two words, because they sound similar, but the difference is ontological.
Maybe it's about, you could interpret that photo as time and a point at which you kind of try in some way to fix time. And in the same way with object. I really don't know where I'm going. That's what I'm going to go. So if you're talking about the photo being layers of time, aren't you?
Mm-hmm.
Fragments of time. And there's a point at which, with the object, going back to this idea of the object, that you're trying to fix something. But that's sort of where the problem is, because the object isn't about what the object is, but it's about what the object is doing. If you think about this idea of it only existing within the context of that being the centre and everything else surrounding it, within the context of its environment. We're trying to fix something within the context of an environment which is constantly in flux. And so even as we pass it around this table, the image is changing for us in some way. I don't know.
Yeah, it goes back to when Karen Barad talks about the growth of trees, and I think I'll go back to the metaphor of the tree rings of time and space. That's on page 181. Going on with what you were saying, is that the question of the nature of change brings us back around to the metaphor of the tree rings. This metaphor is meant to be evocative of the sedimenting process of becoming. In particular, the point is that the marking of time is a lively material process of unfolding. But the metaphor is also limited in several important ways. In any case, it is not to be taken literally as representation, rather it is offered as an evocation and provocation to think with. First of all, the point is not that time leaves its mark, as it were, and marches on, leaving a trail of sedimentation to witness the effects of external forces of change. Sedimenting is an ongoing process of differential mattering. The past matters, and so does the future, but the past is never left behind, never finished once and for all, and the future is not what will come to be in an unfolding of the present moment. Rather, the past and the future enfolded participants in matters iterative becoming. See, it's better the discussion of the quantum eraser experiment in chapter 6.
Can you explain? I mean, can you expand on that?
Well, the way I see it is that each moment in time has its past and its future entangled in it at the same time.
Good. So finally we've gotten to entanglement in a way that's not interactive.
Yeah.
Or intraactive. Coral, you going to say something on that?
No, I just thought that was really clear.
Oh, good.
When you just said that, I thought that was like,
Exactly.
it's
Say it
like
again,
great.
please.
I was pleased.
Each moment in time encompasses the past and the future within it. And in fact, when Degas produced The Little Dancer, age 14, one of the critics said, can he see her future as being heinous? And he's taken, almost like written her future in her sculpture, because they did lots of sort of, I can't say this word, phenomenology?
Yeah, phenomenology.
Phenomenology. And she embodied what they called the criminal face. So she had like a large brow and jutting chin. So they said that she showed every vice in her young age, that she was going to become a criminal, that she embodied everything that they thought was wrong with the face. And I just think that's quite...
Actually, that's great. That might be part of your research then, because the whole question of the criminal woman in particular is quite big in the art history side of it.
Yeah.
You know, that might be interesting for you to at least have footnotes.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Yes, but what did you say that the example was an example of entanglement that is not interaction?
No, I meant that the entanglement, I thought that the way that Sophie was explaining that showed more clearly why entanglement does not ipso facto mean interaction.
Okay, but it's still produced by interaction.
Yes, but they're not the same thing.
No,
Okay,
because one
good.
is a paradigm and one is
An effect.
or like life.
Yes, okay, good. And I thought that what she said clarified that.
No, because then I was thinking that you can see interaction also in this exploding of referentiality.
Yeah.
Even if it's not as clear, but still you can see that through the construction, because the construction doesn't start from a solid ground, and so the interaction comes back in the fact that there's always a context. You never start from a solid.
Yep, that makes sense. Yeah, it's a construct. Yeah, not a solid. It's heterogeneous.
Yeah.
Yeah, good. Joe, how are you doing? With your hand in your head in your hands.
I've still been mulling over reflection and diffraction.
Oh,
Sorry,
right,
I'm
okay.
a bit behind.
It's okay.
No, not in that sense. It's sort of, I come back to that quite a lot, actually.
So what is the attack against the problem of reflection? What's the ontological attack about
For
this?
me, it's like reproduction, and
And how is it reproduction?
I've been looking at in the sense of looking at critical pedagogy,
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the writing about critical pedagogy is about this idea of non-reproduction, that somehow that when you're in a situation where knowledge is taking place or learning is happening, that it's not, you're not filling somebody up with information that which could be classed as reproduction. It's like reproducing.
No, don't use the word reproduction in the
Okay.
definition.
Okay.
But in any case, how do you understand? Setting reproduction aside, maybe that's where you want to go with this question. What do you actually, what are you thinking about when you hear reflection? How does that connect sort of to reproduction for you? Because that's how I heard you make the leap. So
yeah,
I'm just.
But there's possibly only one way of learning, in a sense, or knowledge is there's only one way for knowledge to happen. But in terms of
how do you get that out of reflection?
Because I'm looking at it in terms of critical pedagogy, where they say, where a lot of writers are talking about this idea of redistribution of ideas and knowledge.
But just set that aside for a moment. Just what do you mean by reflection when you hear it philosophically? Like not like literally looking at the mirror, although that is a philosophical remark as well.
Looking in the mirror, I
Forget
don't
about
really
looking in the
know.
mirror.
Yeah, I don't know how.
What does it mean to say self-reflexive, for example, or a reflection that does something? What's the good news about reflection? Why do people like using that? Maybe good news is too slang. Mark, you want to?
Yeah. Rancière, the emancipated spectator, talks about the distance between, in teaching, it's like you have the teacher, the distance is between the student and the teacher. So the distance between what the student knows and then what they can incrementally now know. The distance is that it's not it's not a reflection that the teacher sees the student, and the distance between the students and ignoramus, and must reflect the knowledge of the teacher. It's not that kind of move in Rancière's emancipated spectator. So there's an incremental is also like that crystalline structure there. The movement from the student is the next step they take in their knowledge development, which is that kind of crystalline structure, which is it's a kind of slowing down of time. It's this solid body out of a solution. So there's a time dimensional thing there, and I think so. What Joe's talking about is relates to that kind of these kind of understandings, these different kind of practices. It's not a mirror learning where the student repeats. That famous bit in Dickens, isn't there? Is it Bleak House, where they're all learning? Grad grinds, what is a horse, and somebody describes a horse and gets whipped because he doesn't give a description of the scientific description of what a horse is. No, a horse is this scientific description, and he says, oh, it's a thing with 4 legs, whatever, and gets whipped for it. That's the kind of mirror image learning which I think Joe means by reflection.
Like rote,
rote, yeah, exactly. And then there's these people like Ramsey who talk about these other ways of
but that is not.
practice.
You're right, and that should clarify that part, right? But as our resident metaphysician here, I would like you to explain how Kant is using reflection.
Yeah, reflection is a kind of like the notion of the real, the transcendental, the notion of something outside.
Yes, and so why the Barad approach is counter-indicative of...
Because it's anti-representation.
Yes.
Right? It's not an overarching
if you
one.
can, in a sentence, without going too fast.
Yeah, sorry.
to help.
They are separate apparatuses.
No, you don't have to sing it. You just have to...
Well, a separate apparatus can do different parts of the puzzle without representing a whole. As part of what she says, that she's saying that.
Now, what does Kant say?
Kant says that there's always a movement on a phenomenon with Kant. There's always an outside that cannot be represented on the inside. But the question.
And so, why does reflection matter
always,
for Kant?
Reflection always comes down to the notion, or the philosophical problem with reflection is the idea that there are fixed identities. It's always the problem of fixed identities. Which is a political question, question of transcendental over the immanent. The immanent is the move made by Deleuze and people like this, that it's the inner being, but the transcendental always looks at a beyond and outside a fixed identity which is then reflected back upon us.
Yay, we got there.
Yeah.
Did you get that, Joe?
I did, I'm writing it down.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, that's it. You want to repeat what Mark just said? Does anybody want to repeat what Mark just said? Just that last little bit.
I don't want to repeat the same thing,
Oh, for
but
God's sakes.
Barad talks about representationalism in the book,
Yes.
and that has to do with reflection, and that has to do with the fact that if you believe that existence is built on identities that exist on their own, then every relation you build among them is always a mediation that has something linguistic about it. There's no immediate, there's no given, no relation is immediate. The relation is a mediation all the time. So the paradigm of reflection is always a linguistic paradigm that tries to make sense, to extrapolate sense, to cook sense, to make sense, to produce sense somehow. From
That's nice to
something
cook sense. I really
that,
think that's
that would
great.
never...
That's good.
Is that Italian?
No.
No.
Just is. Good.
Because sense is never naturally there for this ontology, and that's why this ontology needs to be overthrown in order to have a logic of sense, because the sensuous will always necessarily be neglected and negated from this way of thinking, from this ontological grounds of thinking.
What did you say?
Silence. Neglected. Silence.
Poor John.
No, I was helping Ajamo with writing today, so...
Oh, I see. This is like
yeah,
a
and-
private conversation that this has now just erupted. Okay, so thank you for letting us in on this. That's excellent. Go on.
No,
Could I read something from Simondon?
Yeah, because I think Simondon really does
The
clarify
word I
this.
think you were looking for is transmission of knowledge. So he says, form in particular ceases to be understood as a principle of individuation, acting on matter from without, becoming information. In this new conceptual context, information loses the sense conferred on it by the technology of transmissions, brackets, which thinks of it as as what circulates between an emitter and a receiver. So I guess teacher or subject, to designate the very operation of taking on form, the irreversible direction in which individuation operates.
Yeah, actually, I thought you were going to read something slightly different on that, which was the way in which Simmons understands immanence that predates the Deleuzian move and actually is a little bit more closer to what Barad's doing.
Which is that his operative, it's not about metaphor, it's about analogy for him. So that thought can only follow individuation. But as thought individuates alongside the object. So you can't, I think, maybe as you were saying, it's not possible, it's not a point-to-point reflect, you're not in the reflection anymore.
Right.
because it's a production.
It's
a production. It's a making.
It's an operation. It's
a
making.
cooking.
So as you're thinking, you're cooking alongside the object, becoming you're becoming. So
Although the way in which I was using cooking, it wasn't for this. It was to say it was as opposed to the rawness of the sensuous. That was the way in which I was using it.
Yeah. Okay.
But of course, cooking is a good metaphor in general because it implies a chemical transformation, and so actually can be perfectly used for diffraction because it gives a sense of this flipping, this newness of the dimension, how things actually start existing in a performative way, in a way that was not predictable just looking at the ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
And in a way that you cannot go back to the ingredients either.
And yet you can predict something about the ingredients. So that's also important. It's not like you can't predict anything.
No, you can predict something, but like the way in which you're gonna actually cook, the way in which you're gonna perform, that makes the difference between a good dish and a bad dish. Also.
But so does, I mean, I hate to get into MasterChef now as a teacher of this class, but anyway, but so does picking the ingredients, knowing which ones to pick, you know, all the rest of that doesn't mean that you can only, you have to blame your tools if it goes wrong. It does matter what the mattering is, but there are other techniques within the techniques that are also important. So it matters that one is actually good at what they're doing and not just sort of coming at it as a novice all the time, which then gets into this question of intentionality, which we haven't even touched on yet. But first I want to make sure that you're happy. I mean, it's delighted. It's just so happy.
No,
with,
it's just starting to kind of work.
But this is not it's not a dissimilar question to what Andrea was asking about, this question of reflection versus diffraction. So I think first we have to understand how reflection is operating in metaphysics and why, by using the term diffraction, not only does it gently or even not gently move one off of the metaphysics positionalities, but it brings in this different kind of intersection of dimensions rather than layers, or, you know, it starts shifting things around. So you have the interaction, entanglement, superpositionality as your tools of the trade, rather than unity, synthetic unities or otherwise, or things that pre-exist or post-exist the scenario, which in the latter case requires a reflection back to itself in order to make it whole.
Yes. No, I mean, I'm still
Just
thinking
yes.
about this photo, and I kind of in the layers and dimensions. Kind of in layered argument, if I think about it as layers, as superimpositions. So first of all, it's not like you can think about it in many different ways anyway, and that's another kind of point to it. You can say, oh, it's superimposition, and because it's superimposition, there's something to it that happens. If we think of it as such, which would mean, for example, I would read it, if it's superimposition, I would read it as layers. I would read it as, if I wanted to make meaning out of it, I would disband the layers, figure out which was first, which was third, measure them out against time, find the chronos in it, and find that's where the meaning of this image would be in. If I'm thinking dimension, it's the fact that there is no time in it per se, they because they are already there. Yeah, it is already kind of here, there, and so the way you're gonna approach it, start thinking about it, it's gonna be, well, maybe affects, maybe the way it's kind of challenges heteronormative, you know, view of the how time works. You know, maybe it will. So you have different. That's the kind of reflexivity and also the diffraction.
It's not fixed though, it's an object.
Yeah, there's no. That's the thing.
If you turn the temperature up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So and also it's back to Barad's measurements and the kind of obsession of measurements. The changes in measurements as that. You know, as a tradition, there is always measurement that allows you for certain knowledge to make sense. But like for me, the argument is it's not one or the other. That's another kind of thing. You can do diffraction, you can do reflection, but if you're doing diffraction, you're playing very different game of knowledge, of what is knowledge, what is being, and there is no more those kind of rigid rules around everything, which is kind of freeing, but at the same time, you do have this very peculiar sense to it, and it's hard to sometimes. I find it difficult sometimes not to be like what Alberto says, the vague, you know, not to become vague.
Oh, blurry or
blurry
obscure,
or stuff like that, because suddenly you kind of think, oh, so I can just write whatever, like, you know, it's a kind of whatever. It doesn't matter. But then it's about the fact that it is mattering. And that
yes,
mattering.
that is the key here. That's mattering.
Yeah. But also, I think one thing is one can diffract to reflections or many reflections. That is legit. But
Yes.
then if you try to reflect a diffraction or reflect diffractions, you're just doing it wrong. You're actually banalizing it.
Well, if you can
you
do
are
it,
killing the thing you were trying to
the intensity.
You are making an identity, so you're doing bad research, bad whatever.
You're bad. He's poor.
No,
but Alberto is right there.
right.
It's like if you because but it also kind of means like if the method of diffraction, of diffractive thinking, and that kind of method there, the method of that can be represented as such. Kind of that's a kind of, if it can be reflected, it wasn't that to begin with, because that means it failed. It was never a diffraction per se.
No, maybe it was a diffraction, but then you stabilize it. You make it stable. You know.
Yeah.
You lose the grit of it, and you flatten it. You can always flatten a diffraction by banalizing it. It's a risk that you run all the way, and that's also probably the reason why one can never be satisfied with a definition, even if one gives this wonderful definition. We'll always need to be ready to challenge that in the future. Even because that is the beginning of solidification of those boundaries and creation of a new hierarchy, which is inevitable, but it's something that it is the opposite of what research is. But it's also useful, because when you are going to project your success, that's what you are asked to do. And that's the reason why reflection is something that we always will deal with, and we always look for in specific cases, because it's the paradigm of usefulness. We cannot produce anything.
And that's what you were getting at, right? Because you were thinking, pardon me for interrupting, but the paradigm of usefulness is how you were then hearing this critical pedagogy when it's rote, because it's making the children or whoever's in the schools into better citizens, because they're having to become useful in not the productive, creative sense, but in the fit into the social mold sense. Is that?
Yeah.
Is it making so? Because that's a very important point.
That's the way I think of it. Yeah. The idea that an education process kind of makes humans fit into something that's and it does fall into that the linguistic thing and a representational thing, that this kind of sort of how it looks and how the humans fit into that is very, very important.
Because it's a constructive thing. The pedagogy will always be constructive because it's a pedagogy, but then in order to be a diffractive version of it, it needs to have a deconstructive flavor at times that you cannot just let loose, because that would be the end of pedagogy itself. But it needs, you need to know when you can afford that, and that deconstruction is what helps this thing to operate, but to operate in a way that is not crypto-fascist.
Okay, that was throwing something in.
No. Well, in the sense that anything that is pedagogical and constructive implicitly is about imposing the power that you hold, and you want to repeat it, and that's why it is crypto-fascist, just because in the delusion concept of fascism that was well, in what Foucault thinks is the delusion concept of fascism in the introduction to Anti-Oedipus. Fascism is the worship of power, even when it's actually oppressing. In that sense, I said crypto-fascism.
Well, especially when it's oppressing. It's even in the moment when it doesn't look like it's oppressing. It's still the worship, as it were. Yeah. Dane, you look like you're on the verge of saying something. Andrea is.
Yeah, maybe how I got to it, Joe, is in the way that I'd say if you have this idea of knowledge that you can actually, or knowledge represents a particular reality, that's something where then the teacher comes in as the deliverer. It's like you can really, like, you take something, you can as something would be there, and you can take this and deliver it to the students in a way that, you know, like this kind of way of transmission, that there is this passive kind of communication of the recipient who is the student and the teacher who is the one who delivers the knowledge, which represents the reality. Whereas I understand the move of Barad is the way that actually this move of performativity comes in, where you
That's
say
very important. Yeah.
the performativity of knowledge in a way that that it is transforming itself with each time you are actually in front of the student, because there is this dialogue happening where, or there is this situation that perpetuates whatever there actually is. That's how that's where I see there's a surplus in why this can improve the situation of teaching, or of confronting yourself with how you understand knowledge and your position as a teacher. What I fail to do is when I'm in the lab with my project, and you could see or there is this symbolic meaning of waste, then my move would be through my practice saying, all right, that's a way of I look at it at a different way of that's the and that's the question, is it the embodiment of photography in a way that this is the body that in various way I can open up and make or extract the experiential knowledge that's in there.
Well, like this image here, just going back to this image, could be, I think, seen as a performativity of knowledge. It's not just you have to be the teacher coming in. An actual work can be having this dance going on. Your work does this. Alberto's work does this as well. It's kind of it starts to perform itself in the so-called encounter. And so what's getting encountered is not just the let's say the person that's not in the picture and whatever but the elements within the image are doing the performance. But there's also this performance around the elsewhere.
And isn't wouldn't that be then the entanglement in a way that who's actually who's taking part in this event of encountering it? Isn't that like that's the space you create?
I think that's too literal a sense. I think that we, kind of yes and no. If the elsewhere is brought in to create the wider field of knowledge and experience, then yes, it's entanglement. But otherwise, it may not emerge as a interaction or as an intra-action or as a dimension that happens. It may not happen, in which case it's not, the entanglement's not going on. So you have to be just careful. It's almost like entanglement is kind of not something forward that you can project, but something you can say is happening or has happened. It's not the to come. Well, that's not true. It is the to come, but it's not the waiting for it to come. It's in fact the imminent versus the transcendent, which Mark was talking about. Yes.
I think, in fact, that at the beginning of differential repetition, Deleuze talks about the event as something that cannot be predicted, because that will imply a generality, will imply some pre-existing axis. That would be the law. The event has to disrupt the law, and so the entanglement as the structure of the event happens always in this violent way, in this the positive disruptive way, and it is always coming, but you can't have an appointment with it.
That's nice. It's a more positive way of waiting for Godot.
Well, that's waiting for Godot is exactly.
It's a depressant.
No, not the play. Like that sort of waiting. That's exactly the way for the encounter not
Exactly,
not
that's
to
what I
happen.
understood. Yeah. Exactly right. Waiting for Godot means the encounter will never happen.
Yeah, it's
Yes.
exactly like double checking every split second if you have fall asleep. It's a sort of a.
That's a good example.
Do you know the idea in to go back to what Andrew was saying? You know the idea in Dessertu about the peruke, the wig, and bricolage.
Mm-hmm.
The notion that
I don't remember it though.
what you have like in a workshop or something, it's where the workers take back. They break the law. They steal from the boss, as it were. They use the email to send their own messages and workers' time, or they take offcuts home with them and make things out of the offcuts, that kind of thing. So it's kind of breaking the law. You're not meant to do that. It's like any kind of apparatus sort of becomes something else. It becomes something. So it might be designed.
Becomes a possibility.
It becomes a possibility.
Yeah.
So it might be designed for one thing, but all of a sudden it's veered or it's gone queer or whatever like that. Like language or something like that. The use of language might get shifted. So I think this is kind of what Andre was saying with the entanglement that is all was already imminent to as a possibility. It's already imminent to the thing or the practice. This querying of the practice, let's say, if I put it like that, perhaps, it's already imminent to apparatuses that somehow they're going to become entangled, or they already are entangled already. Just wait, as Roberta said, it's from the future that the point will be reached. There's the dimensional possibilities already. There's been uncovered, perhaps. I think that's perhaps what Andre was saying about the photography and the outside of photography. That the practice is it's already there. That it's an artificial boundary as such. That the non-photography. I don't know.
Yeah, Barad talks about it, which we discussed in my supervision as the kairos of desire, and kairos meaning the super moment, and it was used in Greek as an alternative to chronos.
K-A-I-R-O-S.
Yeah. Shall I read that bit, because it's really pertinent to what we're talking about. I think he's looking at this photograph of Maplethorpe, this sort of early self-portrait, and he's discussing why it's erotic as opposed to pornographic. And he says the erotic photograph, on the contrary, and this is its very condition, does not make the sexual organs into a central object. It may very well not show them at all. It takes the spectator outside its frame, and it is there that I animate this photograph and that it animates me. The punctum, then, is a kind of subtle beyond, as if the image launched desire beyond what it permits us to see, not only toward the rest of the nakedness, nor not only toward the fancy of a praxis, but towards the absolute excellence of a being, body and soul together. And he goes on later about the heavy desire of pornography from the light good desire of eroticism. After all, perhaps this is a question of love. The photographer has caught the boy's hand, the boy is Maplethorpe himself, I believe, at just the right degree of openness, the right density of abandonment. A few millimetres more or less and the divine body would no longer have been offered with benevolence. The pornographic body shows itself, it does not give itself. There is no generosity in it. The photographer has found the right moment, the kairos of desire. And I just think that's really relevant to what you were saying, Mark, about being inside and outside the photograph, like there being no limits.
Which is
a kind of Baradian
truth
concept.
in painting, isn't it? The
Yeah,
paradox
definitely.
where the frame is both inside and the outside of the painting at the same time.
And yet, what Derrida is saying, and in fact even what Bart's saying, is a different version of that inside-outside transition than what Barad is saying with entanglement. And the question is how to clarify what that difference is. Like, what, I mean, maybe we don't need to clarify it right now, but but I think it's worth knowing that it's not the same version. There's something that's required, or anyway, maybe not required in the Barad move, as it were, that is required in Bart's to make an assessment about the kairos. Does anybody want to take a stab at that? John doesn't want to take a stab at anything.
I think for me, I'm the kind of idea about the punctum sounds very individual. And I'm not sure if everybody could kind of look at it, because basically the whole book is based on the Mapplethorpe image, but then also it talks about the woman and the shoes, and then there's something about the shoes that he comes to, and it calls out the punctum, but then actually it might be something else that we kind of might be drawn to in terms of the image. So really, I'm not quite. There's something about kind of the Barth's text that doesn't quite hold for me around the punctum and the difference between the erotic and the pornographic and that kind of stuff. But I still can't quite get to it. But it doesn't quite hold.
I think the punctum is a tricky concept, because I think Barad he wants to say something, but he probably just doesn't have the philosophical background to frame it in a way that is not misleading. I think the punctum is this misleading, well-intended way to frame.
He's a pretty profound philosopher, so.
Okay, but it's like it's that.
He probably does know what he's doing.
Take them on.
I'm gonna challenge this dead philosopher.
Okay,
no,
that's right.
It's because he wants to talk about the event, but he wants to go there through a punctum, and I wonder if the reason why he looks for the doorway to the event in a punctum is that he still grounds on this classical ontology in which things are punctual, because if that punctum works, it is in a deconstructive way because of the relation, because of the context that make that be the punctum. To talk about.
But the punctum's nothing to do with the punctual. It's to do with piercing.
Yes.
That's what it means.
Yes, but he's.
It's
Yeah, and that piercing is exactly why he wants to talk about the event. It's just that by using this concept of punctum, I think he makes the thing a bit complicated and tricky and contradictory, because that punctum can be piercing, can break up and create this doorway, this passage for a new dimension of sensuousness, precisely because it's not an self-standing individualized punctum that exists on its own. It's a sort of like the hotspot of a complexity, of a functionality that irradiates in the whole of the artwork, in the whole of the image. So that probably if you take away a corner of the image, that will not be the punctum anymore. So I just think that he was absolutely well-meaning, and he was going towards the event, but he got trapped into this sort of a misunderstanding, and I guess it's because he still thought that an answer could be punctual, an answer could be self-standing on its own, and if he had read Derrida properly, he would understand. No, he would have understood that
Derrida actually hadn't written. It would have been hard to read it. He'd gone into his head.
And I just think.
Saying. No.
But Derrida wrote in the 60s as well, so.
As well. It's like, yeah.
As well, so there was a chance.
It was that they could have read each other, yes.
Yeah.
But I mean, Bart's is coming from semiotics and representation.
Yeah, and that's why it's very good that he managed to go from semiotics to talk about something that is like the event, but he was just not coming from.
I mean, I love our conversation with you about patronizing. We're gonna sit down.
No, but like,
the patronizing.
It's not patronizing. I'm just trying to contextualize why I think he could not really do what he wanted to do. But there's no patronizing. Of course, if I was living in his epoch, I would be a horrible writer, and I would have not gone anywhere anyway. So I'm not putting myself on his position. I'm just trying to contextualize why I think he was doomed to fail his attempt to go to the event from semiotics.
Yeah, but for me, okay, yeah, the fact is that to find the universal that explains it all.
Yeah,
There's a whole problem with the way that the traditional ontology and epistemology kind of was, it's a kind of the one thing can explain it all, and the punctum is a product of that as such. That there is a one thing that can explain the image or make sense out of the image, which is kind of that's why it becomes problematic, because especially as a photographer, you're such a materiality of taking photographs. It's all about puncting, it's about this. It's all about measuring. You have a little, in digital photography, you have a little red square that focus, function, all those. It's always to the point when you take a photograph, which is weird enough.
And he says, sorry to interrupt, but he says on that point that you have to hear the shutter.
Yeah.
So digital cameras put that in, but they don't need it at all.
Yeah.
But we just need the
Which is
noise
another
of the camera going.
Like as digital cameras, they don't need shutter.
Yeah, but I'm just
No.
thinking, actually, because
They
you've
can
mentioned that
have
before, but in
Yeah.
the context of the RH report, I'm thinking the shutter is like that sound that creates a new surface, and therefore makes an interesting way in to understand the image. I mean, this is just an initial thought, just
Yeah.
coming from.
No, that's very interesting.
Yes. Those who have not spoken before. We only have one or two. But James, you're not going to speak, right? No. Okay. James is just sitting in, so this isn't. Do you want to speak? No. Not even to say no. That's excellent. Stuart, you got any comments on this?
Where would you start? I don't know. No, not at the moment.
I mean, I know that it's late. I mean, not just at 6:30, but at in the month, and people are working to deadline and are totally exhausted. However, let's try and take a positive away from where are we in all this and how it will help you in your work. So, does anybody want to sort of sum it? In fact, Guy, why don't you try the summary, because you haven't really had your day in the sun yet for today. You're in the shade or in the rain. Do you want to sort of kick this off so we can get a bit of closure on, or not closure, but like some sort of way of understanding this? What for you today have been the important points?
Actually, I was thinking a lot about what Jane said about throwing the dice.
Okay.
And how that kind of was a way in for me. Also because it kind of brings in those different times with Eon and Chronos, that's in the logical sense when it speaks about it, how a series is being disrupted. But then I was also thinking that that throw of the dice, I think maybe the problem, and that maybe kind of relate to the problem of Bath, that it is also part of that. It's a part of the series. It's not something that Deus ex machina moment that interrupts the event. It is the event, and so in that throw of the dice there is already the fragment, and there is already a certain, and it's a certain speed. And I think for me the reading of this week was I read it through, or kind of trying to figure out the question of speed in those things, because I think we relate to time still in some homogenic way, and we do not. I was thinking about the method that I'm using, for example, of giving company with that company, of slowing down the tapes. So whatever tape it is, I just slow it down first thing, like kind of, and what's in it? What's in this slowing down? And I was reading Gene Epstein, the Intelligence of Machine, and he speaks about speeding up as part of the argument of how machine, like to kind of demonstrate he says when you speed up things, then you reveal the movement in something which looks innate. So it reveals the kind of the another truth that we are not being able to figure out. That would be a way for him to say that with acceleration, connections are being made which cannot be made before, and that becomes part of the machine work, and that becomes part of its intelligence. So I was trying to make kind of a move, but in a reverse way, and that kind of slowing down things, and then I thought that perhaps slowing down is more related to this kind of diffraction that, because when you slow down the tape, then at certain points you still have a structure of whatever was, for example, if the song, so you still have a certain structure. But then at a certain point, it just becomes something else, and there are just like vibrations, and it's become so weird. And it's still the same tape. So what is being happened in that when you really slow down the tape, that those movements which are being unified as a line become discontinued. But in that point, they start to form other lines. So they kind of speed up at some in that sense again. So that movement of slowing down and speeding up is something that is I think happening in this entanglement in the creation of dimensions.
Yes, and also because the slowing down and speeding up they're not on the same plane. They're not. Or because in some cases in your work anyway, a lot of things that are going on here, the slowing down and the speeding up are happening at the same time. That doesn't mean it creates inertia. It creates this odd friction, and they're not in the same plane. So that's why I can understand this diffraction thing coming in. When they are on the same plane, when it's the same song, I know, when that is actually happening, even that's not on the same plane.
Yeah, but I'm thinking that when they are on the same plane, you're already in that slow down scenario.
Yes.
And that starts to speed up, and that becomes. That's what I was.
That's interesting. Did anybody else follow that?
Yeah, it was so useful for me.
Yeah, I thought that was good. Can you somebody want to retranslate that in case anybody is?
It's about attention.
Yeah, the tension, not the tension. Yeah.
Disparation between the two, and it's almost like putting the brakes on something creates more energy. I believe electric cars now generate energy when you put the brakes on, because they use that as a way to recharge the friction, recharges the battery, so it's the carbon.
That's interesting.
Not a carbon.
Or an electrical engineer, but anyway.
But it's about energetics, isn't it? Again, and that's probably the problem with Barad, is he couldn't make that jump into energetics.
Well, because the intensity becomes a point.
Yeah, and then you're back to that point point to point of the mirror, of photography, of lenses, and Barad is saying no. Well, she's not saying no, but that's a certain way of looking at things, and it's very relevant, important.
Which brings in a whole ontological structure.
Yeah.
And so to step outside that or step away from that is then bringing a whole different assemblage or apparatus, as people are saying. Coral? Making sense?
Yeah. I'm just I'm kind of been thinking about stuff to, I guess, to do with my PhD research in that I'm interested in this kind of, in Newtonian science that we learn at school, and then this is something slightly different, with something completely different. But in terms of the way we approach knowledge as well, so going from a Newtonian imperial hierarchical structure of knowledge, and those metaphors being very much grounded in the architectural space of the museum, but then with new notions of knowledge being cloud, being vapour, being pulled out of something that we don't quite understand, and that's how we approach things, and things in that sort of constant flux of becoming, how that relates to what I'm trying to do with interpreting museum objects. So I'm quite interested in that applying this sort of quantum physics to an understanding of knowledge in a digital sort of age. I'm quite interested in that. And the other thing with the shutter, which I love, is the other thing I've been doing this week is doing like a live coding event, which is totally terrifying, so I've got to type and put people. And I've kind of, because I've been in the store and the museum, I was like, I can't really put music on, it's kind of frowned upon. So I turned the microphone of my laptop onto me and my sounds and my typing. So as I live code, as I code, right?
Being alive.
And I put points into it and make those kinds of aesthetic choices. Just by me doing it is affecting what's happening. It's becoming difficult to read, and there's this kind of, tension there, and also I'm quite interested with the shutter, because the way this software works is that it's going on 60 frames per second. So every 60th of a second, potentially, a calculation is formed on what I'm doing at that moment, and then also what's happening in that kind of environment at the same time. But also it's highly related to how the computer's running, because that's if it's not lagging. If it's lagging, we might drop to 30 frames per second. So it's kind of interesting that kind of how that. So I was just thinking about how that fits into like a practice as a digital artist working with computers, and that sense of the live.
When you say live, does that mean somebody's watching you?
It means that, so normally if like with a code, you prepare a code and then you execute it. Live coding allows you to manipulate that code
as it's happening.
So it's just in constant flux, and also you're reacting with code to a stimulus.
So the reason I was asking is that because in Barad, I now can't remember which chapter, when she starts talking about simultaneity and not the segment, but it's a kind of criticism against Bergson's simultaneity and duration. So simultaneity for her is the duration, and then there are the sort of the cuts, which are really like scratches, or not cuts, within her simultaneity. So it sets up different challenges around duration, and that's how she gets to this notion of the multiversal of time as an event, as a multiversal event, and then it comes together, but again, not as a unity, but as this cohesion.
Yeah.
So, and that creates different forms of the. I'll have to find it. The different forms of the way in which the cooking happens.
Yeah, I'm interested in how it kind of, I guess, works, and that we interpret it as film and we interpret it as being linear, because that's the way our eye understands it. but the actual way it's being made is calculation after calculation, and each frame is new, even though, say if something's rotating, it might rotate incrementally, but still the way it's generated is it's not generated by moving something, it's generated by a new sort of, so it's kind of a, I want to say cut, 'cause it might be the wrong word, but it's kind of, you know, it is, and then it becomes
it is like a, it's almost like the William Burroughs jump cut.
And I like it that it can be manipulated by my own act of doing, and that I have the microphone on that, and I quite like to, because this event is happening in a gallery space, and there's going to be coders coding music, but I quite like to, if I can, as people, you know, mic up the space a bit as people walk in, and maybe do something reactionary to just kind of the space. Maybe that's an interesting way for me to take it, possibly more interesting than just, you know, DJing can be a bit dull.
Not necessarily, actually.
Live coding has that performative element to it, so it's sort of like if you go to see a musician, where instead of a musician you've got programmers at their laptops coding, and
you can read the code. The code is on top of the visual, so that's the slightly worrying part, is that if you know, my type, and if I get nervous I shake, I'm dyslexic, there's a lot of problems with me typing in front of people. But it's kind of that, the ethos behind it is that you show your screen so that it removes the mystery of AV, because this is just laid there, this is kind of what it is. But I was interested in the way it, in each, you know, it appears linear to us, but it's not. It's singular calculation, sort of based on environment, and also on how I'm functioning, how I'm performing, and how the computer's functioning as well.
I did a live mapping piece for the Conservatoire a few years ago, and they made me sit on stage with the musicians with my computer, so I felt really, really like under the spotlight. And then one of the conductors actually made me get up and bow at the same time, and I thought this is just ridiculous, because I was just producing the image that was going on. I mean, I'd made the images reflect the pieces, I'd had the pieces beforehand, with Ed on this. It was a really interesting piece to work on, because I had to make it exactly the right length for the pieces, and they varied when they performed them. Even in the rehearsals, there was like seconds where they were sort of slightly different. So I had to sit on stage and anticipate when they were going to finish and close down my thing at the same time. But I literally just sat and pressed the button and then waited for like 10 minutes to press the button right at the end to finish it. But there was that element of performativity as well, because I was up on stage with the musicians, which was quite interesting.
I also find it fascinating that there's an argument about something being, that there's an ethos involved in revealing, as it were, because there is nothing to reveal. Not even when you show the code. Not even when you, that's not even revealing. You know, so I mean, it's something that we can discuss further. But I find that an interesting way of thinking that there's some kind of ethicality involved, or some kind of community of just showing that things are just constructed, as it were. Because very few people. Do you know Jody, the group Jody?
No.
Anybody know Jody? J-O-D-I? Yeah. So there's some artists that basically only do code. I mean, their whole, in fact, their art pieces are code, and I'm sure they stand for something, but it doesn't really matter what they stand for. And they are completely into the revealing of the code, but of course it's not saying anything. So they're in that case, it's getting into the prostitution of the reveal, because it's just it's showing, it's revealing, but it's not saying anything. It's not giving. It's not generous, or whatever that came from before. You know, so which I think is an interesting move that goes on.
I was thinking about your fake in the box and the lagging you mentioned. Like for some reason it sounded very connected. The lag in the frame rate.
I guess don't know. A lag is almost like
it slows down.
Yeah, but it's not. It's not just a slow down. I don't think it's as simple as a slow down. It's you're not purposely slowing down. It's not reaching optimum.
Yeah.
So it's kind of, you know, you might see it as a negative, like as a letdown, but also it's something about its own operational function
Yeah,
that
but
makes
that's,
it lag.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm
I'm not
thinking.
sure.
Fake.
Fake.
It's interesting.
Because well, if we think about those the series of objects, we think series of objects, the identities, yeah, series of identities, series of objects, series of things. But if we think series of events or the kind of they are alive in a way, you know, that each of them has is time-based thing, yeah.
Yeah.
Then the fake becomes this thing that requires a processor to work a bit harder, which would make it lag.
Yeah.
The computer would lag because it needs to run the process again and again, like a few times in order to produce. Yeah.
I was
thinking
of it slightly differently in that bringing in the. I think I'm always thinking of bringing in the fake. So bringing in the fake.
Oh yeah.
Makes, you know, that system, that group, not be optimum, because it is kind of another computational process, and that rather than going, all of these are real, you go, is it? So we are, you know, that could be a lag in our own sort of computation.
Interesting.
That's a different form of performativity, isn't it? That you're sort of almost putting a break into performative. So the words like optimum and performative make me think of work. And all those, you know, all those performance management things that you have to do. I mean, performance can be a very negative situation to be in.
Yeah, are you performing at your optimum? Never.